All right, welcome to the Ship It podcast. My name is Brandon. I'm here today with Matt Merrill, who is one of Rocket's more recent employees. Awesome. I'm just going to let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name's Matt. I come from a Java background, and I recently, 3 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, switched to JavaScript, and I'm mostly a server-side dev.
Yeah, good man. I'm not going to hold it against you that you came from Java.
Yeah.
A lot of us did.
I still like it.
Yeah. Do you?
So, yeah, it has its place. I haven't used it in a long time.
Yeah, I haven't either. Since like college era, I think.
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, this is actually a great segue because today we're going to talk about what it means to be a backend dev in 2019. You know, we've seen a lot of shifting landscape here. You know, a great example is we used to build things in Java. We don't do that anymore. We see a lot of things around serverless stuff, a lot of hipster technology, real-time, WebSockets, stuff
web
like
scale.
that. Yeah, AWS, anything. They have so many services, it's hard to keep track of what. I feel like they do everything probably at this point.
Yeah, and more.
And that's, then there's like this blurry DevOps line of like, where does backend stop and DevOps begin, which we talked about today. We had done an exercise earlier where had a bunch of us speaking about like kind of mind mapping out everything that's related to backend dev. And that map, we had probably 10 people working on that, but it got big fast.
It got big real fast. It was hard to scroll across.
Yeah. It really pointed out like how much, and then we had all these like discussions over, does this even count as backend dev? Is this DevOps? Is this tooling? It's all sort of is backend dev.
Well, it's like the iceberg, right? The tip is, I don't want to minimize what front end devs do. It's huge these days. It gets more important, but I mean, there really is an iceberg underneath there, right? And like, I think that the level of specialization as you go deeper down there is really important. Like, you can't be expected to know that all and do it well.
Yeah.
And it gets full stack is a whole nother topic. But I really believe you can't be good at everything. Yeah,
it's funny you mentioned that. Right now, we're sort of hunting for some full stack devs because we recently opened a New York City office, and we need that kind of skill set to start that office. It seems like you need that full stack generalist sort of knowledge when you're at like that startup level. And even though Rocket's not a startup, the New York City office is. Yeah. So we need someone who kind of has all those chops to sort of help hire out that team. So we've recently switched over to like looking for that full stack role, but then we had to define what that role was. And I remember like, what is that nowadays? So what I ended up, and we're still working on this, but what I ended up saying was like, I want someone who can stand up a server on their own, from like zero to deploy, like be able to host it. I can hit an endpoint, hit an API, do some CRUD operations on whatever users, let's say, creating, updating, deleting users. I don't necessarily care so much about authentication in terms of like, I should rewind. We've been considering doing homework. So when we do phone screens, it's hard to understand like where their level's at. So we talk about homework or maybe interview tests or quizzing them while they're here, pairing sessions while they're in the interview. But because backend is so big, it's hard to focus on like, what do you actually focus on to make sure they know what they're talking about? What we see is full stack people, they'll say full stack in their resume, but what they really mean is I worked on a team where this was already set up and I ended up creating a controller and a couple routes, but that's it. Like no migrations, no doing it from...
They haven't bootstrapped it.
That's right. Yeah. Maybe I should start using that word when we hunt for these people, bootstrapping.
That's what I always told like my old team is, bootstrapping something is one of the most valuable things you'll ever do to learn about this stuff is getting it going from scratch. But if you work with something that somebody's already done for you,
you don't learn that much from it. Yeah.
No, you don't. Yeah. And
it's funny when we were talking about front end, when we did, there was like a year of, I would call it my Webpack hell, where I was just configuring Webpack all the time. And I was just like, this is not fun. And this is getting old because it's always a different config and it was always a different flavor. It wasn't like bootstrap. I mean, it is bootstrapping a front end project, but it was so much more painful than bootstrapping a back end project. But it's really valuable. And a lot of people are so afraid to touch it, they never will touch it.
Right.
Which is unfortunate. Yeah. I wanted to show you, I don't know if I can without breaking my screen, but can you see this image here where there's like this cuddly bear above the water and it says front end and there's rainbows on it below. It's like this kraken and skeletons and tentacles and stuff. Yeah. I feel like it's a good analogy for what back end is because, from a front end, so my history is started off as like that generalist, like more heavy on the back end, moved toward the front end. Like, I mean, back in my day, it was like PHP and MySQL and LAMP, right. and then it was Flash. So quick switch to front end, and then it was like this. Oh, no one cares about Flash anymore. I guess I'll better learn JavaScript, and that's how I got to where I am now. But building the backend stuff then, it seems so much more straightforward than it is now, just because there's so many options. And before it was like, well, you mean LAMP stacks, like Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Like, what else could you need?
Yeah,
you know?
that's true.
And now I don't know how to evaluate people based on what they know because they come from so many different stacks. But you're right. Bootstrapping is one of those things that I feel like is a must, right?
Yeah, for a full stack dev, yeah. Like I guess there's no good definition of what it is, but I like what you said. Like, can you get something going from scratch?
Yeah.
Maybe not even necessarily from scratch. Do you have the resources to pull from to bootstrap something from the ground up and not just take from what's already there? I think also, like, adding on to what you said, I don't know if I'd necessarily expect a full, quote unquote, full stack dev to be able to scale something out. Yeah. You know what I mean? And make it operational.
Sure. That's very DevOps, yeah.
Right. Like that's where I start drawing the line is, okay, you're gonna create multiple instances of this. You need to load balance it, yada, yada, yada. That starts to me to get into DevOps. And that's where I think the line is. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think like a good back-end engineer needs to be very aware of those things.
Sure. Like, you need to know load balancing exists.
Right. You need to know, you need to design for it. You need to architect for that, but maybe you don't necessarily know how to do it on the back end, and especially not a full stack dev, right? Like, I don't know, maybe unicorns exist. We want a unicorn, right? Like, but realistically, are you going to get one of those? I don't know. So.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing we see is that they have jobs that they like right now. So wooing them away from a job is really hard. The people who don't have jobs typically aren't the people who are like really good at this stuff. Yeah. Unfortunately, it is just the hiring nightmare of it all. But it's tough. I don't know if I should be focusing more on the traditional or the modern. You know, I guess. Well, I should say if someone came to me and they're like, "Oh, my backend experience was like I had to set up code gateway on AWS and a bunch of lambdas, and that's really all I've ever done."
Right.
And I'd be like, "Well, that's interesting. Even if you've never set up a database, that's at least interesting because no one else has done that." So then I'd be like, "Oh, is this actually valuable? Is this something we should pursue? Or is this sort of like another one of those, someone kind of set it up for me, I never really interacted with the database and I don't understand." We talked earlier about this. We were talking about relational databases and like what's proper versus what feels right and how you want to interact with it. And I think it's easy if you're not experienced to just be like, well, I'm supposed to break all these things up into tables and make it relational. And sometimes you're like, well, the solution doesn't need that. That's overkill. But I think that comes with time.
Yeah.
So it's hard to judge those things. I want to know how to ask those questions. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
One thing I've always asked of interviewees, you know, when after they give me they rattle off some experience they had or some project and what they did on it, I always make sure to say, okay, and what was your role on that? Mm-hmm. Were those decisions made for you? Did you make those decisions? It's always very interesting to hear. It's many times what I would find, and maybe it was my past company, many times what I would find is, oh yeah, no, those decisions were made for me.
Yeah.
And I mean, okay, there's nothing wrong with that.
No,
but it's
more common than I thought.
Yeah, it's very common, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But sometimes the way that they speak about those things, you're like, oh, they did this.
Yeah, they have
the case.
Yeah, it's weird. The wording is very confident. This actually happened recently. We did a phone screen. I thought someone was like, you know, confident with the Redux side of things, but their gripe with the current place they were working was that there was a lot of like oppression over PRs and like, you can't name your constants that, you got to name it this, and you don't have your comments this long, and line lengths are too long. I've worked on that. It's annoying, but it was not that obvious to me. And then another coworker ended up speaking to her on the phone as well, and got a totally different side of things, like, oh, I don't even like doing it and I refuse to do it that way. And it's like, well, that's a terrible attitude, but it's two different phone screens, two different things, and finding that out at the interview process would have been hard. So I'm trying to figure out how to find out that people, I don't care if they have strong opinions on the back end, like, oh, I really like Firebase and I stick with it because of this, and you know, sometimes I have to use Mongo, and that's okay.
Opinions are good.
Yeah, opinions are good. As long as you're, well, what do we always say here? Strong opinions, loosely held.
Yeah, as long as you're flexible.
Yeah,
you know when to lose. You know, like that's the thing. You know, it's fun. It just jarred a little memory. I was just reading a book, Apprenticeship Patterns, and they had a quote from Bill Gates saying like the real test of a programmer is you hand him 30 pages of code and see how fast he can decode it. And that got me thinking, like, we spend a lot of time having people create code, but really one of the biggest challenges is, can you get into a code base, figure it out, decode it, and then maybe provide some constructive criticism.
That happens, and I feel like on the back end, that's a much bigger skill. You can almost work your way through the front end a little bit because there's a little bit more structure, but the back end, we talked about this earlier, there's, especially in Node, there's not a lot of best practices, so people kind of just do whatever they want. I always end up seeing what I call like hacker scripts, where it's like a bin folder, and it's just like, just Node run my script, like one of my 10 scripts in there to get something done. You're like, does this deploy? Does this build? Like, what does this do? And you do have to decipher it. So maybe you're right. Like, there are a lot of things, even if we end up taking a project, like a legacy project, and we're like, we're not gonna like update the legacy project. We're just gonna like migrate it to something more modern. Understanding how it works in the first place is key. And there is a different skill set from setting something up and getting it running from scratch, which is nice because you got nice and shiny, nice and clean. It's like getting a perfectly brand new operating system. You're like, oh, this computer's so fast, I can do anything I want, as opposed to inheriting something where you're like, I don't know how someone wrote this, or 3 people wrote this, or however many people ended up writing it, and it can be hard to decipher it. So, John, what he was saying is sometimes when they do like these coding tests, he'll give them a data set, like a CSV file, which is nice because you have like a flat file database, and it's up to them to iterate over that and insert into a database of their choice. That's
a good one.
But he puts in junk data in some places. So they have to worry about like processing that and catching that bad data, which is a big part of being a backend dev. And it's funny when he said that, I was like, oh, that's so true. I've gotten so used to just like cleaning and scrubbing data over time that I kind of forget that it's like, oh yeah, that is a definite backend skill. This is why I need people to tell me these things, because I forget that they're that it's like it's just I got so used to it over time. I forget.
Well, there's another thing too here where we're talking about all these expectations of developers. It also depends on the level and the level of experience. I would never expect somebody who's green, even a year, out of school or whatever, to be able to do that, right? There's a huge difference in our level of expectation. And I think you and I are talking about much more senior people because that's who we've been hiring. And we've only just been starting to talk about hiring entry-level people. So that's a whole... I would hate for somebody to hear this and think like, "Oh God, I'm not up for this." But like, we're talking about well, you and I.
I'm comparing it to myself.
For at least 10 years, right?
Exactly.
Each, right? So,
since I guess I started when I was 15 years. Holy crap!
Yeah, I'm going on 14. So yeah.
Wow, that made me just feel old.
Get off my lawn.
Yeah, right. Totally. It's true. I look at all these candidates we see a lot of boot camp stuff too. And in boot camps, I'll either see very front end heavy stuff with like a Rails backend or just Rails. I never see anything that's like, we're going to teach you Express at this boot camp. So all the people who are learning stuff are coming out of college. It's very front endy heavy. Especially because there's like frameworks that are really popular, like React. It's like, oh, if we teach you React, we can give you career placement. Those boot camp things are so focused on like career placement after the fact that they try to focus on those industry buzzwords. And Rails is really easy to teach, so I see like we get a lot of that. It's so much of it's configured for you. It's like you don't get to make that decision. That's the convention of Rails.
There's something to be said for it, especially if you want to get going fast.
I mean, learning REST APIs with Rails is probably the best way to start because they take away so many of those decisions for you.
Yeah, I don't have very little experience with Rails, but that's what I've heard.
Yeah,
so, if John was here, he would.
Have something to say. We did this project, and we'd started using. It was related. It was Postgres on the back end. This is where I was telling you we had started with SQLize, and then I hated the migrations, and then we were thinking about going to Connect, and then we ended up going to TypeORM because we thought we were going to bring on a junior developer eventually. And then as I was working with one of the developers who was doing more like the data modeling stuff, he was a strong Rails dev, and I'm not. And he kept asking these questions like, where do I find this thing, this Rails equivalent in Node? And I was like, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. I felt bad after a while. Like, it seems like Rails is the better choice for relational data, at least for what we were doing on that project. And eventually we just made this decision like, let's just kill the TypeORM thing and just switch to Rails because it's got all the things you already know Rails. That was a big part of it. He already knew it and you could take it on. And on top of that, it was just much more suited to that project. But I didn't know that until he talked about it. So, it's, for me, Rails was like, I kind of know it like tangentially. I did the whole 5-minute blogging tutorial back when, but
that's about what I'm
like, ooh, scaffolding, neat. Right. But I haven't touched it since then. It's still popular. It's funny when we were hiring people at Brightcove before, it was like Rails people were West Coast. And it was hard to find them on the East Coast. We had to like ship them out. I don't know if that's still true.
Interesting. Yeah.
I know John, he's had candidates here and there, but he's had a hard time finding Rails people. Yeah. So maybe it's just the nature of our geography, or maybe it's dying, or maybe it's just front end people are coming out of the woodwork left and right.
The front end thing, with the original theme of this, right, was like back end people. And you mentioned before that a lot of the people coming out of boot camps are front end focused. As somebody who has a back end slant, that's something that like I don't know if I'd say worry about, but I have my eye on, right? And I see stuff like that. I see stuff like Firebase. I see stuff like quote unquote backend as a service, like Parse used to be.
Yep.
We were using one at my last place to do a mobile app. That stuff is fantastic. Mm-hmm. And if you can buy software as a service that's just backend as a service, I mean, a ton of what at least I've done, I don't know if you can say the same, is basic CRUD stuff. You put a few rules on top of it. That as a backend dev like makes me a little. It gives me a little. What's the future here? Sure. Backend is starting to be almost like an afterthought because of stuff like that. Which kind of, this is a half-baked thought. I don't really know where I'm going with this.
You're right.
But when we started talking today in that mind mapping exercise about everything, it seemed like all roads led to DevOps.
Yeah.
And like that's where I wonder, like, okay, is the code, the kind of the middle layer there kind of going to just start to be real small, real commodity like, and really the real challenge of the I'm using air quotes here, back end dev is just going to shift to like all that DevOps. Yeah. Make sure it can scale. Make sure that it's that it's operational and stuff.
Make sure
like
it continuously deploys.
Right.
Yeah. We're looking at this for a few projects right now, but I also think that we're going to see a lot more of it in 2019 in general. Is the headless CMS. So there's a lot of these out there. Contentful is the one we see is like the big one. Their pricing is crazy weird all over the place, but their offering is pretty great. There's a lot of contenders in that arena too. Like a lot. So many that we were looking Brian Busby, who's a recent hire at Rocket, he was looking into this and he found an article from this like CMS blog kind of thing that was 24 headless CMSs that you should be keeping your eye on in 2019.
Oh, just 24.
Just 24. Just to keep your eye on.
2 a month.
Yeah, it's a busy space, but it brings all that like content modeling and CRUD stuff and caching layers and staging tokens and all that stuff you have to think about when you're building out a backend as a service. And it's funny to me, I personally don't want to pay $500 a month for Contentful, but from an enterprise level price, they don't care. That's fine.
Good backend engineers are expensive.
Seriously.
And hard to find.
That's right. Yeah, as we've shown. Yeah.
But yeah,
I do think that we're going to move that way toward
I think
more of
so
that stuff, because on top of that, if you think about, just think about us. If you hired us to build a backend, and eventually we're going to have to update it. There's going to be some database thing or some security update or whatever, but you just get that for free when you pay for backend as a service.
Yeah,
I always like picking up Firebase when I was doing like hackathon stuff because it was exactly that. It's like backend as a service. Yeah. I can just start writing data and not have to think about security and all that stuff, or the authentication was a snap. And I remember thinking then, oh boy, maybe this is where backend's like, it's just going to go away. It kind of hasn't. It seems, or not yet. It seems like we still have plenty of customers that have their own custom thing, SQL, Postgres. Maybe they even want to start that way and move that way. And I don't think we're not going to lose that whole like Java, I got to figure out the backend, I got to figure out these CRUD APIs layer for years. But it'll happen, I think.
I think it's starting to get commoditized. I mean, when that mobile project that I mentioned, we used the backend as a service on, I had myself and another very strong backend dev who was good with architecture and stuff like that. We both were evaluating options for what to do for this backend. And this was 2-3 years ago at this point. And we started looking at one of these backend as a service tools, and we all knew Node, we all knew JavaScript. It used that to do customizations. You could do pre-post hooks. It just saved it into a Mongo-like data structure. We were like,
seems great.
Oh, this seems great. And there was some hesitation on our team towards it. I think it was maybe a little bit fear-based.
Yeah.
But we were under the gun to get the thing out, and man, it worked really well. And like it came out of the other end like, man, I wish I could use this for everything. I never used Firebase, but it was very similar to that. And like, I think if I were to do something over a greenfield, I would start there. I'm not necessarily saying I would prescribe it for everything. I'd be like, why not? Is there a reason I shouldn't? I
tend to have that. Not everyone agrees with this. I have the mindset that if you're, especially for startups, or you're just a hackathon or whatever, it has a similar. Hackathons and startups are similar. Just be fast, get it working, then get it right. I think, in my opinion, it's better to spend a little bit in the early days of a startup to where you're just like, I'm going to use Backend as a Service. I'm going to use this ImageX for my images. I'm going to use file upload for all my video uploads, and I'm going to use Mux to do my video processing. And it's just like, sure, those services cost money, way more than it would be if you built it in-house, but you're going to get to speed to market is like way faster. And then eventually you're like, oh, no one's even using the image uploader, but everyone's using the video uploader. Let's optimize that for our cost. I think a lot of people try to solve all that stuff themselves from the get-go. And as to your point, it's like backend devs are expensive. So it might not be saving you money by trying to do that from the get-go.
Yeah, that was my biggest. I grew, in levels in my last job, and that was the biggest takeaway that I came away with is, like what can you do the cheapest? Or maybe not even the cheapest, but just the quickest.
How
do you test it?
Also is a cost. So if you look at it on paper, if we built this in-house, it would cost us this much a month to run it, but it'll take us 8 months to build it. Right. It's like we build this off the shelf, it's a month and a half, but like, man, look at that bottom line. That's a big sticker price. Let's work on bringing that down over time. And then eventually, that gets deprioritized. And you're like, man, this bill is insane. We got to get those AWS bills down.
Well, it's a forcing function. I mean, it's also like I describe it as like an investment portfolio too. When you have a set pool of money that you can spend on this software project, where is the value? Is it on the front end for your right directly to your customers, or is it on the back end? There's no right answer to that. Like depending on who you are,
different,
right? Yeah, but. Where's the right place to spend that money? Maybe it's not on the back end. Maybe it is. I don't know.
It's true. One of our customers, they have that same problem to think about all the time. They are sitting on a lot of complicated scientific medical data that they have to surface internally in a way that makes sense. Yeah. But they also and they build their services around that. Like, how are we going to surface this data that other things can use? And they think very back-endy about all that stuff because they have to. They do have a few products that use that data to show that information to a customer, which takes that extra eye of like, how are you going to present this in a way that makes it understandable to a customer or a patient that maybe even a doctor doesn't have to explain it. And that's a tough thing to do. But those are, that's the challenge of front end is like, how do I make all sense of all this information? Whereas the challenge of back end is sort of, how do I organize all this information so that you can do whatever you want with it? I love APIs that I use, like third-party APIs that just seem like they offer up like 10 ways to skin the same cat. It's like, we don't know how you're going to use this information, but here are a bunch of APIs for you to access it.
That's a great that's a great point. Like, one of the things I love about backend dev is like kind of the art of crafting a good API. It's so hard to do.
Oh, totally.
It's
but
hard.
You know when you're using one.
Oh yeah,
like Twilio.
Yeah. I never used that one.
That was my first one where I was like, this feels like I'm reading poetry.
Yeah. Isn't it sad? But
it is. It's true. After you use a bunch of garbage APIs for a long time, you get something nice, and it's just a breath of fresh air. Yeah. And it can be done. And I don't actually know what it is that makes it so easy. It's got to be like ease of use or something, or I don't know, consistency maybe. But people nail it.
That's a good question. Yeah, Microsoft Graph is another one that's actually surprisingly good.
I'm wearing a Zencoder shirt, which was purchased by Brightcove, so there's a little bit of loyalty there. But they have incredible APIs for encoding. Big fan of that. Yeah, there's a handful of them out there. Mux is a new one. It's actually, some of the guys from Zencoder left to go make like an even simpler version of encoding video, and so that's a great one. If I had to think about it, there's probably like a short list of less than 10 APIs that I'm like, these things are just top notch, just the best. High charts, that's a good one.
So I think we've arrived at, watch out, you might not be writing any sort of middle logic, but you've got to really be good at crafting APIs and start thinking about DevOps.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, even on a product I just did, there was we used WordPress as a headless CMS, and WordPress is not known for being the most performant database, especially when you add a lot of custom stuff, and they had a lot of plugins. And we had to surface data in weird ways, and it ended up being that we'd had to make several API calls to get this information to build like the object we'd need to show a list of articles or just one article or whatever. And the time to make all those requests was so long that we just had to build a caching layer. Like, I wasn't planning on building a Redis caching layer into it when I had started. Had I thought about that initially, I would have built it differently. It's got a little bit of a Frankenstein feel where you're like, oh, you added Redis at the end, like that, that kind of thing. I mean, it works fine. It could use some refactoring to make it look like Redis first, database second, kind of.
But you got it out.
But we got it out. We had to figure that out at the end, and we had to roll with it. And that's part of the interview that I want to figure out, or part of the phone screen, or whatever the process is to find this person. We interviewed one person here It's interesting. I won't name him. He was passed on initially for a totally different role, and then I saw the person's resume, and I was like, oh, I want to talk to this person. And in the interview, he had never worked with Vue, like Vue.js before, and I was like, we're going to build this thing with Vue, and I'm going to teach you it in 5 minutes, and then the rest we're just going to refer to docs. And in an hour and a half, he did it. And then he took it home and worked on it some more and nailed it. And I thought that was a hugely valuable skill. I was like, I'm going to throw you into it to something you've never touched, and let's see how well you do.
Yeah.
You did great. And I almost want to figure out how to ask those questions to people before, or maybe during the interview or that kind of thing. And I don't know how we do that with back-end interviews. That's tough.
With back-end interviews.
Because we mentioned earlier, like data modeling. And, if we move away from, I had to once set up a relational database to, I just defined everything in contentful. Your models are just like these flat objects that you can be like, I have an author, and then over here I've created a list of those author component types, and it's not that hard to use. It's very easy. It's very visual,
But I think that modeling skill though could be applied to how would you design the API for this?
Yeah.
What would you do? And this type of stuff that I'd be looking for is, are you asking questions to the people that are the clients of this? Are you involving them, or are you just going off on your own and saying, I think that this is the best way to do it?
It's true.
You know what I mean? Like there's a personal skill to that too. That's
listener.
very important. Yeah. Really, kind of who are the clients? Who are the domain experts? Are you asking them things? These are more the soft skills, I suppose.
Yeah,
but I mean, that stuff's really important.
I agree. I think half of our job is soft skills, honestly. It seems like it.
Yeah.
I mean,
to be good.
Yeah. Well, I made a recommendation to one of our customers the other day. Same one, we did the headless WordPress CMS, and I was like, this WordPress thing is like a stepping stone. It's not ideal for what you want to do. So let's see if we can get you onward from there. And I presented 3 solutions. And even though Contentful was the longest timeline of a project, which probably makes it seem like we're trying to upsell them, even though that's not true. The main reason I offered that up is this is the solution that we recommend, is because it prevents vendor lock-in. It's like they aren't tied to us. If they ever want to leave and go somewhere else and have some other developer work on Contentful for them, no problem.
Nice.
And that's nice and easy for them. And I'm a big fan of that. I want to prescribe the right solution, not just go off and be like, I had this thing and I barely listened to anything you said, and here's your answer. I've dealt with those people before, and they drive me nuts.
Yeah, that's also a really good characteristic of a front end engineer. Is was I talking with you about this earlier? No, I was talking with John about this earlier, about how information hoarding is such a bad thing. And I mean, that it is in general, but especially as a backend dev, I feel like your goal should be to make that damn thing, that complicated thing, as simple as possible. Operationally, the API, it's just a giant exercise in simplification.
And that is
if
the
you
art.
can do that, that's the art of it. That's what I love. I'm a geek in that sense. But
when I first started, my APIs were sort of kind of like the PHP library, where it was sort of, there's a method for everything. It's like, you want an endpoint for that? I got a dedicated endpoint for that. It's like, how many endpoints do you have? A lot.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be that way. Now it can be much more. There is an art to it. I like that though. It's like you're designing it. It's almost like you're creating. It's weird. It's hard for me to explain to my family and girlfriend or whatever that even though it's ones and zeros and I'm writing software and it's a very logical process, so much of that writing process is actually creative.
Yeah.
Because you have to figure it out, and sometimes you aren't in a creative mood that day and it doesn't click, and you're not in the zone, and it's tough. Actually,
that's the part I love about this job.
Yeah.
It keeps me going.
If it was just solving math problems all day long, I probably would not enjoy it.
I almost didn't go into it because I thought that it would be like that. Yeah. So
I'm not even that great at math, and I tell people that all the time.
I'm terrible at it.
I had to relearn algebra 2 so I could help some people get through their classes and stuff. And I remember learning it and being like, oh, this makes so much more sense now that I've learned programming. First time around it, I was like, algebra, when am I going to use that?
Get it, yeah.
Running up on about 30 minutes. I think it's a good length. Yeah. Unless you have more you want to chat about.
No, I can't think of anything. The art of the API.
Yeah.
That's what I'm taking away from
Ooh,
this.
I think you just came up with an episode name here. Yeah, so in true, I guess, agency fashion, instead of reinventing the wheel and trying to come up with our own ideas, we're going to steal an idea from other podcasts and talk about picks, things that we find. I did the air quotes there. Picks. I know JavaScript Jabber does this, Syntax FM does this. I'm sure plenty of others do as well, where we're just going to talk about things that we like: software, books, movies, songs, ideas, anything that just sort of strikes our fancy. So I'll lead. My pick for this week is Code Sandbox. There's a lot of these things out there like JS Fiddle, CodePen, JSBin. They all work differently. They all have different features. Code Sandbox is very modern, and I might be mistaken here. I think it's written by the team who wrote Meteor. No, I am mistaken. That's Apollo. That's a different thing entirely.
Okay.
But anyway,
I didn't know Apollo was the same team as Meteor.
I believe that's true.
Okay. All right.
And so Code Sandbox is fantastic, and when you open it up, they give you a bunch of options of like, I want to do a Nuxt.js project right out of the gate, which I love because I actually love Vue and Nuxt, and setting it up is a pain in the butt. So you can kind of like get up and running really fast in the browser. You can write your tests, just tests right in the browser, see the tests run. It's got a very visual code-like environment. In fact, there's a preference in Code Sandbox to switch it so you're actually using Visual Studio Code in the browser, which is pretty fun. So they're always making new updates and stuff. And so if you're like me, where you like to like kind of tinker, that's a really good option. And also, I should mention this since it's tangential. Jordan, one of the people who works at Rocket, sent out a link the other day for an app called Run.js on the Mac, which is basically like, it looks like a terminal window, but you're just running JavaScript in the console right there. So it's really handy for like, oh, how does that function work real quick? Or like in Lodash, is it the first thing that's a method and the second thing's an array or a string? And like you just test it real fast and get moving and stuff. So what I used to do is I'd open up like the console in a browser, like in Chrome DevTools.
That was my
thing. And now I have like a dedicated thing for it, which is kind of handy because, you know, if you ever accidentally close it or refresh the page and like hit up, there's my test.
Does it like save what you've done?
You can save it in a file.
Sounds like Jupyter or something.
Yeah,
like Jupyter notebooks.
It's like a handy little tool. It's handy for that. So I like those kinds of things like proof of concept tools. So Code Sandbox and Run.js if you're more like just right down to like I just want a node REPL kind of thing, then that's probably more.
That's cool.
Those are my picks.
Yeah, mine is not nearly as concretely useful, but very interesting. Somebody at Rocket recommended. We were talking about logging out, like processing of messages, and I said, "Do you log at when we get a message, do you log this out?" And he said, only if we get an error. And he said, following the Unix philosophy of if a program has nothing useful to say, don't say it. And he linked me to this article of a write-up of the Unix philosophy. And I'd heard of the Unix philosophy before, but I didn't realize it was codified in some sort of document, I guess. And this was a write-up from the University of Rhode Island. And it's just a fantastic, like, gathering of all of this very, very practical software engineering knowledge that some of it I already knew, but if I were reading it for the first time, it would have been extremely valuable for me to know. Just all these like legends, like I think it was his name, Ken Thompson, who wrote some of the core stuff in Unix. Do one thing, do it well. Make sure that
modular philosophy kind of thing. It's funny because I've heard these things over time. Like one function should do one thing and do it well, but I didn't know that came from a Unix philosophy.
Right. Like I mean, all this stuff. I mean, I love Linux, and just I love the bounty of different I love learning something new about Linux every day. And like when you read these kind of design principles, you can see why it's as good as it is, and it can really be applied to almost anything. Anyway, so we'll get the link out there, but it's a really fascinating read.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even have a site for this yet, but there will be show notes, so we'll put the link in the show notes. Yeah, there you go. That's cool. It's funny you were just saying, that's why everything works the way it does in Linux, and the first thing that came to my mind was how difficult it is to just get like an MP3 player on Linux.
Well, like
there's this like
funny, in a GUI or
yeah, sure, or whatever. Just because you have to like install the lame encoder and all this stuff. You have to like do all that. Or like libmp. I can't remember what it was. It's been a while since I've done it. There's a funny GIF of I guess I'll put this in the show notes too, of what's his name? Bryan Cranston from Malcolm in the Middle, where he's like, he goes home and he like flicks his switch and like that's not working. Then he goes to go fix that, and he goes in the garage and like something's not working there, so he's got to fix that. Then he goes somewhere else and that's not working. It's like this cascade of things he's got to fix before he can go all the way back and just turn the lights on.
Maybe I should put a caveat on what I'm saying. Not as a consumer OS. Okay. As software engineer, like all the server. Utilities. Yeah, as a server. As a server.
That makes
sense. No, I don't use that as a consumer.
I wonder if you've read through that, if one of these is the philosophy where we see a lot of, it's hard to talk people down off the sledge, and we have customers who do it, where they try to solve a problem today that doesn't exist yet. Sort of like, well, we'll build our software now, we'll shore it up now, and that way later when we use this library, it'll just be ready to go. And it's like you spend all this engineering time now for something that doesn't need to be solved.
Yagni. Have you heard of that?
Yagni.
Oh. Yagni. You ain't gonna need it.
You ain't gonna need it. That's it. Yeah.
So I think that's in there somehow. It's not Yagni, but like that's what
There's a Unix term for it.
Yeah. There's a Unix term for that.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So that's I think this is going to be episode 1 if the audio comes out great. So we'll see how this goes. But this format will change over time, I'm sure. We're all going to just work on this and see how it goes. But
be agile about it.
We'll be agile about it. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. Thanks, man. Have a good day.
No, thanks.